Come to me, you who desire me, and eat your fill of my fruits. One of the phrases in that first reading of today that just catches us, pulls us in. It's an invitation to enter fully into the image that's being created for us in this wisdom saying. Wisdom in that first reading from the book of Sirach is personified. It's as though it has its own being, identifiable, almost tangible, one that you could reach out and embrace, one that invites you to come into her presence, who says, be with me in all who I am. Let us be greater together than we could possibly be apart. It's a wonderful reading. Thank you, Annie, for reading it so well, capturing that imagery. It captures the sense that wisdom is such that flows from the Godhead, flows right out of the divine presence, that in fact is part of God, God's self. Look, some of the readings, some of the verses capture that imagery of wisdom having been infused into all of creation, right from the start, right into eternity. I came forth from the mouth of the Most High and covered the earth like a mist. Alone I compassed the vault of heaven and traversed the depths of the abyss. As high as you can go to as low as you can go, wisdom is there. Over waves, over the sea, over all the earth, and over every people and nation I have held sway. It's a fabulous testimony to that presence, that wisdom that flows out of God and in and through everything, empowering all of creation, including us, to be the absolute best we can be. But I know what you're thinking. That's one of the graces of ordination. You get to know what you're thinking. And you're thinking, Sirach? Sounds like a hot sauce. Where's this book from? Who is this Sirach character? I'm not familiar with that from our regular Sunday readings. Sirach? Who is this guy? I'll tell you. The full name of this book, if you came from a Roman Catholic background, you might know it as the book of Ecclesiasticus, which is in the wisdom writings after the Song of Solomon. If you came from a Reformed background, like, say, United Church or Baptist or Presbyterian, you'd say, never heard of this guy. If you came from a Jewish background, you might say, the name sounds vaguely familiar, but I'm not familiar with the text. The full name of this book is The Wisdom of Jesus, Son of Sirach, or in Hebrew, the Wisdom of Yeshua ben Sirach. And we don't know the name of the actual author, but it's one of the very few books of the Bible that is defined as having a distinct person as an author, the son of Sirach, and we just call it Sirach. And the reason we know that is that whoever wrote this book in about 180 BC, that's when it was earliest compiled, about 50 years later, this guy's grandson got the text and decided it was important to translate it into Greek so that more people could read it. Because the scriptures of those days, the Hebrew scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, had been translated into Greek around between 200 and 150. So this fellow said, this book should be in there as well. And so he translated it, and in that translation, he put in a prologue. This is my grandpa's writing, he says. And I think you should have it. So here it is. And my grandpa lived about 50 years ago in this time, and I'm here in this time, and he identifies the time by who is on the throne in Egypt and all these kind of things that really can let us narrow it right down. So about the year 132 BC, this book came into existence in Greek. And in our Bibles, so in this, my study Bible, it does show up. It's in the what we call the apocryphal books or deuterocanonical. There's a big long name for something that means added later on into the canon of scripture being what's in the Bible. And it recognizes that in the earliest texts that we have, for instance, the books written in Hebrew, it doesn't actually show up, or mostly because it hadn't been written down yet. It came late into the canon, which is the accepted collection of books. And so that's why it's deuterocanonical. Came later, that's all it really means. So when the Catholic Church was trying to assemble its Bible in the Latin language, known as the Vulgate version, vulgar meaning just in the common language, not meaning crass, but in the common language. So when the Vulgate was composed by St. Jerome, he included it, and a bunch of other books as well that we're not really familiar with on a Sunday by Sunday basis. But the book of Sirach is in there. So the reformers in the Protestant Reformation in the 16th and 17th century, they wanted to go back as far as they could to get back to the original text, get rid of all this stuff that's been added to it over all the time. Let's get back to the purity of the scriptures. So they went right back to the Hebrew as far as they could. But the Hebrew version of Sirach had been lost by that time. It wasn't recovered until the early 20th century. So they didn't have it. So they didn't include it. So if you came from, as I say, a church from the Reformed tradition, Presbyterian, United, Baptist, Pentecostal, you would not have this book. If you came from a Catholic tradition, you would. And the Anglicans, being the middle of the road people, we kind of have it. It's there, right? It's in the Bible, but it's kind of sandwiched between the Old and the New Testament. And we use it as almost canonical. So is it actually the Word of God? Well, yeah, but it's not quite as good as the Old Testament and the New Testament. But it is a wonderful book. And I've got to say, if you want to read about Jewish wisdom sayings, read Sirach, because it's a collection of traditional Jewish wisdom. The kind of wisdom that says it is not all about us. The kind of wisdom that says collectively we are much stronger as a people than we are as individuals. Kind of wisdom that says, care for everything, care for all of creation, care for those who are less fortunate. The widows and the orphans is the way the scriptures have it, because in traditional times, widows and orphans were people who were in severe risk of losing their lives through starvation or other deprivations. Care for everybody is the way that these wisdom writings read. A lot of it is in poem form, and that's today's is part of a poem, not like our poems now that have rhyming couplets and all that kind of thing, but it flows and is descriptive and leads us into imaginative imagery of what is being called, what we are called to understand what God is like, what God calls us to be. Because this description of wisdom is very definitely divine in origin. It very clearly says that wisdom comes from God, and in fact is God. And the imagery that's used, even in what we read today, covered the earth like a mist, came forth from the mouth of the Most High like breath. And you can imagine that image as being just like the early creation story where the earth was void and formless, and the breath the Ruach of God came out and covered the earth and gave life. It's the kind of wisdom that was exemplified by Hilda during her life. As she lived in the 7th century, mostly in the northeastern part of what is now England, Whitby area, you know the country, right on the North Sea. She was a Celtic princess and had been a Christian from fairly early in her life as Christianity moved across, starting that Celtic strain of Christianity, moved across from missionaries that went up into Ireland, across into Scotland, and then down into Northumbria, the northern eastern part of England. And her call was such that, I mean, she must have had leadership skills as well. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it was a leadership that was infused with this wisdom of saying, who can we be as a people? So fairly early on, she went into a monastic life as a nun, and then rose to the position of abbess in a monastery which was founded. She didn't start in Whitby, but that's where she ended up. She was the abbess there. And the abbey in Whitby, in accordance with Celtic tradition, would have included both women and men, living probably separately, but working together, probably worshiping together in a collective monastic existence that brought them strength and health as they could look after each other, brought them security and the ability to go out and minister in the communities around them. That was the best model of monastic life. Those where people could live in a community and support each other and be covered by whatever health care they provided to each other, but also could go out and extend mission and ministry into the communities around. The Venerable Bede, who wrote basically the first history of England back in the, I remember, the 8th century, only about 75 years after the time of Hilda, comments on her as being someone who exemplified wise leadership. And we don't know much else about her. The reason this church is called St. Hilda's is that in the early 1930s, the bishop of this diocese, Archbishop Adam de Poncier, was on a fundraising trip somewhere up in northeast England. Ely Cathedral is where my memory team seems to take me. And he was preaching and he said, for the cost of one of these pillars, I could build 2 churches on the west coast of Canada. And by the end of the service, he had the money. And he built St. Aidan's in Roberts Creek. The building is still there on Roberts Creek Road. And St. Hilda here in Sechelt, named after 2 Northumbrian saints. So that's why we're called St. Hilda. But even more than that, I'd like to think that we are called St. Hilda because of who we are as a people who have a sense of wisdom, who reach out into the community, who might even be sought out from time to time as those who could help. I got a call on Monday. Can you help? So-and-so, my friend's husband has died. Can you help? I know St. Hilda's is a place where we can come. That's the kind of imagery that this place is and has been for all of its 80 years of existence. Hilda was sought out by kings for counsel, some of the legends go. She's most known as being the chair, the host for what's called the Synod of Whitby, which was somewhere in the 7th century. And it was all about what is the English church going to look like. So you're going to imagine that the As I mentioned, the Celtic Christianity had come from Ireland and moved across Scotland and down into northeastern England, and most of the northern part of Britain was Celtic. Meanwhile, up from Rome and up through the Holy Roman Empire, Augustine had come to Canterbury and had established a church in southern England, and on basically the Roman style of organization and leadership and practice. And so gradually these two influences came together, and the question is, well, we only have one church. What's it going to look like? Happens time and again in history, doesn't it? All sorts of different issues. This particular case, there were two flashpoints. One was, when is Easter? Because the dating of Easter has always been a bit of a challenge, right? It still moves around the calendar. Depending on who you are, even today in the Orthodox tradition, Easter is on a different day than what we practice here. So is Christmas, for that matter. So the question was, when is Easter? Let's get this decided. And that's a kind of one of these things that people can get their teeth into, right? It's easy to figure out. Let's talk about dates. The other was about haircuts. Not serious, don't laugh. So for monks, the tradition was that the tonsure was on the top of their head. For those in the Celtic tradition, the tonsure was on the front of the head. I go with both. So they were trying to decide, how shall the men cut their hair? And again, it's one of these things you can get your head around, right? Anyway, really the question was, what style of Christianity are we going to follow? The Roman style was a lot more regimented. The Celtic style was much more free-flowing. Hilda was a Celtic practitioner, and she saw the wisdom of being a good host, that her being a host ranked higher than her own personal practices, her own personal desires. And so she hosted this synod, and the outcome of the synod was that the church in Britain would follow the Roman practice. So this part can go back, if only. Interesting result. And here at St. Hilda's, however, there's no question that we follow what has, evolved from the Roman practice. We have our lectionary, we have our order of service, we have our 4 hymns, 3 readings, a psalm, a sermon, the Eucharist on a regular basis. But we in this place are also infused with the creation that's right through these glass windows that seats us in the forest of this property in the greater context of the marvels of creation all around us. And that has infused us with this sense of our place in God's creation, our responsibility for caring, for being not stewards, but co-creators of what God intends for this world. So I see us in this parish as ones that live into the legacy of Hilda, who would say, I want this. However, I can see a need to be something else in this time. My personal feelings are A, but for the collective good, let's explore Z. Let's look at the total opposite end of things. Let's look at the way Jesus said about the fall. You start reading Jesus's parables in their purest form and his teaching in their purest form without all the additions that the gospel writers have put on. And my goodness, that's a radical gospel. The first, I guess that's us in this society, isn't it? We're going to be last. And the last, those who are put down or disadvantaged or poor or refugees or in danger of death or don't have water, all the stuff that goes on in this world, those are the folks who are first in the gospel of Christ. It requires us to put away our own personal desires in favor of the greater good, and the greater being marvelously much greater than anything we can ask or imagine. But that's what the wisdom of God calls us to do and to be. So how do we do it? I look around this place, the reality is that we're mostly gray-haired. We're mostly people who are old. Not me, but the reality of that is that we also come with lifetimes of wisdom, lifetimes of experience that can be drawn upon by others. And you might say to yourself, I'm not a wise person, and I beg to differ. Because individually and collectively, this place is a wise collection of Christ's followers. As we move into the days ahead, how do we extend that? How do we let that be available to our community? I was thinking of, coffee in the mall on Friday mornings. There's a great place. Or men gathering at the Lighthouse Pub. It's also Friday mornings, isn't it? I'm always working, but I can't go. But Friday mornings at the Lighthouse Pub, a place where collective wisdom is to be found. In the past, we've had things like the Gospel of Thomas study group and the Wisdom Circle, these things that COVID put a pause to. Wouldn't it be great if they could start again, or something like it? Think even of the ACW, the collective wisdom that's in that group. This is who we are as a people. So my invitation, the invitation of the writer of Sirach, of Jesus, son of Sirach. Come to me, you who desire me, and eat your fill of my fruits. For the memory of me, of wisdom, is sweeter than honey, and the possession of me sweeter than the honeycomb. Those who eat of me will hunger for more, and those who drink of me will thirst for more. May it be so in this place and with all of us. Amen.